The 2015 NBA draft was an interesting one in the sense that, unlike the prior draft class in 2014 where you had so many high-level prospects, even though that class ended up being a bit of a dud, but in 2015 you only had two, and really just one, that were thought to be franchise-level players, future stars in the league, and that was Karl Towns and Jahlil Okafor. Yes, tanking for Okafor was a thing. It's always funny to go back and look at old hashtags on Twitter, and tank for Okafor was a big one leading up to the offseason of 2015, but outside of these two big men, the rest of the draft class for the most part was seen to be fairly weak. Not saying that's what ended up happening or that the prospects weren't seen as quality NBA level prospects, but it wasn't expected to feature a ton of stars in the making. So in this video, continuing on with the redraft series from the last 10 draft classes, we're going to be redrafting the pretty underwhelming class of 2015. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy the content, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribe to help the channel grow, as it's only 2 months old, and in return I'll be providing more NBA content like this all season long. Now, like the other redraft videos, we're going to only be redrafting the top 10 picks from the 2015 draft, starting at number 1. This one really is a toss-up between two players who have really outperformed the rest of their draft class since entering the league, and by a pretty wide margin when you look at the rest of the players who come after these two, but that's Karl Towns and Devin Booker. Cat obviously went number 1 overall in the draft, and Booker fell all the way to 13, which I'm sure a lot of teams are kicking themselves for not drafting him earlier. And as good as Cat has been, 3-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA player, he won Rookie of the Year that season, an elite scorer, can shoot it from outside, but also an effective passing big man as well, I would still probably take Devin Booker number 1 overall here. I mean, for a while, there was a lot of talk about Booker being overrated because he was putting up empty stats on a bad Suns team. He wasn't that efficient, but more just a high usage, high volume scorer at that time, and his game didn't really translate with winning with how bad he was on defense. But ever since Chris Paul joined the Phoenix Suns, you've seen this transformation from Booker, and that he's actually stepping it up and giving a crap about playing defense. He's been so much more lethal and efficient on offense as well. Much better shot selection, much better decision making, and I mean, I know the Suns got embarrassed on their own home floor in the playoffs last season, but Booker has been the best player on one of the best teams in the NBA, finishing with the best record in the league last season. I mean, I really think it's safe to say that Devin Booker is a superstar in the NBA and should be recognized as such, and that's why I have him going number 1 in a redraft. Now, with Booker going number 1, it's pretty easy in my view for who is going number 2, as really the drop between the two best players from this draft is pretty substantial when you see the players that are going to follow them. So here we have the LA Lakers selecting Karl Towns, which honestly would have been such a big pickup for them over D'Angelo Russell, who they took number 2 that year. They kept him for a bit, then moved him to the Nets. D'Lo then gets traded from the Nets to the Warriors in that Kevin Durant signing trade. Then the Warriors move him to the Timberwolves in exchange for Andrew Wiggins. But Cat on the Lakers, you have to remember the Lakers were pretty bad then. This was the tail end of Kobe Bryant's days with the team, but they had Julius Randle, who they just drafted the year before. Obviously, they go on to get consecutive number 2 picks where they draft Brandon Ingram and Lonzo Ball. Who knows if they would have ended up actually getting those picks had they drafted Karl Towns, but envisioning a core of Cat, Ingram, Randle, and Lonzo would have been something incredible to build around instead of what the Lakers have right now. So the Lakers take Karl Towns here with the number 2 pick. With the 3rd pick, this is where the Philadelphia 76ers selected Jahlil Okafor, and I mean, hindsight is always 20/20. I think any team that had the 3rd pick in the draft after Karl Towns was already off the board, they would have taken Okafor here. He was the number 1 recruit coming out of high school. He was thought to be a star-level talent in the NBA, and while he actually had an okay rookie season, he was doing so on a very bad Sixers team putting up empty stats. He also had some off-court drama issues, just really never seemed to be motivated to work hard and improve his game after getting into the league. He bounced around to a few teams before ultimately finding himself out of the league after the 2021 season. Who would have thought a number 1 recruit coming out of high school would be out of the NBA by the age of 25. So obviously the Sixers aren't going to take Okafor here. Instead, with the 3rd overall pick, they're going to take Kristaps Porzingis, who actually went 4th in that draft to the Knicks. Porzingis has had a fair share of injuries, obviously, which has limited his career a bit from the days when people were calling him a unicorn, the next big star in New York. He eventually gets traded to Dallas after it was perceived he didn't want to be in New York because of the lack of direction from that franchise, which kind of expect if you're going to be playing for the Knicks. Doesn't fit with Luka in Dallas, so he gets moved to the Wizards. And honestly, he's not the star level player we once saw in New York, but he's still a great big that can shoot it from outside, rebound well, block shots. And again, when you look at the rest of this draft class, you realize Porzingis going 3rd actually makes sense compared to some of the rest of the guys that we're about to go through. At number 4, this is where the Knicks selected Porzingis, but since he's taken off the board in this redraft, instead the Knicks are going to take D'Angelo Russell, who again went second to the Lakers in the actual draft. D'Lo, like I mentioned, a solid player. I wouldn't consider him to be a star level player by any means, even though yes, I realize he did make an all-star team when he was with the Brooklyn Nets. A good scorer, but a high volume scorer, not the most efficient. He's one of these players that can get hot in a hurry and make you pay if you don't play him hard on defense, but at times he goes extremely cold and puts up 3 for 14 shooting in a given game, but all around a good player relative to the rest of this draft class. That's why I have him going number 4 here. At number 5, this is where the Orlando Magic took Mario Hezonja, who has been one of the bigger draft busts in recent memory. He also is already out of the league, wasn't very impactful when he was in the league. So instead of taking Hezonja, the Magic are going to take Myles Turner. Myles Turner is actually one of the few underrated, under the radar type of players in the NBA, and I probably only think that because I think he would be an amazing fit on my Chicago Bulls. But be that as it may, when you look at Myles Turner and what he's been able to do relative to the rest of the class, an elite shot blocker and rim protector, he's actually 3rd among his draft class in win shares, 7th overall in box plus minus. What's been most impressive to me about Turner has been his ability to improve his outside shooting, his outside game on offense over the course of his career. So far this season, shooting over 41% on 4 attempts per game from behind the arc. He's also improved his overall rebounding, which was somewhat of a knock on Turner in those early days of his career because he's a 6'11 center who would average around 6 rebounds per game. This season, he's averaging close to 8. All in all, I feel he's one of the lesser players talked about in the league in terms of their overall impact on the court, and it's why I have the Magic taking Turner here 5th overall. With the 6th pick, this is where the Sacramento Kings botched yet another lottery selection and took Willie Cauley-Stein 6th overall. Willie Cauley-Stein had a lot of promise coming into the league, playing for Kentucky, was athletic, a mobile big that could crash the boards, and while he had an okay first few seasons in the NBA, his game slowly trailed off and now finds himself out of the league after being waived by the Rockets prior to the start of this season at just the age of 28. So instead of Cauley-Stein, the Kings are going to select Terry Rozier, which I know, no offense to Rozier, but it kind of speaks to the lack of talent in this draft class when you have Rozier being drafted with the 6th pick. For the Kings, this is more of a case of best player available, but also it was actually a good fit for the roster at that time. Would have been great for the Kings considering they had a lot of bigs going into the 2015 season. Again, adding Willie Cauley-Stein really didn't make a ton of sense for them there, and the Kings were stretched pretty thin in the backcourt, so to have a combo guard who is a versatile scorer, decent passer, would have been a nice pickup for them, even if he was just used for a trade trip later on, like the Boston Celtics ultimately ended up doing with Rozier later on down the line. With the 7th pick in the draft, this is where the Denver Nuggets selected Emmanuel Mudiay, and while I'm sure in hindsight they wish they could have that pick back, Mudiay was actually one of the few prospects in this draft that was seen to have star potential, not as much as the likes of Karl Anthony Towns and Jahlil Okafor, but Mudiay was the number 2 overall recruit coming out of high school, only behind Okafor. He had this weird season where he was going to play college basketball, but then decided to pass on playing college ball and instead chose to play overseas for 1 year before entering the draft. And yeah, right away, Mudiay just did not fit well in the NBA. Had a decent rookie season, but really after that was never able to gain the kind of traction that scouts had hoped for, was very inefficient, turned the ball over a lot, wasn't that great of a passer for a point guard, and as of right now, he's already out of the NBA. Yet another top 10 pick from that draft that is already out of the league only 7 years later. So instead, with the 7th pick, the Nuggets are going to select Bobby Portis, who is another underrated player in terms of his impact on the court and being the type of role player that will do whatever is asked of him, hustles, plays with a ton of energy, and isn't afraid to get physical, like the time he punched Nikola Mirotic in practice, and the Bulls later on traded him as a result. But Bobby Portis for the Nuggets gives them some energy, scoring, rebounding. They also already had Jokic by this time, who had been drafted the year prior, gives them some great depth in the front court. Even though, yes, I know Portis took some time to develop, it still would have been a better option than Emmanuel Mudiay. With the 8th pick, the Detroit Pistons selected Stanley Johnson, yet another high-level recruit coming out of high school for this same year, had really high hopes in terms of his potential going into the NBA, and like Mudiay, just never really found his footing. A decent defender, but very poor on offense, ended up becoming more of a journeyman after eventually getting traded by the Pistons. So instead of Stanley Johnson, the Pistons are going to take Montrezl Harrell. I know Harrell has fallen off substantially and has barely been able to play this season for the Sixers, but Harrell, has been, outside of the Sixers currently, has been very valuable for virtually every team he has played on. A solid scorer and finisher in the paint, a good rebounder, and although his defense has fallen off, back when he won Sixth Man of the Year, his defense was actually really solid. And it might surprise some people to know that Harrell, out of the whole 2015 draft class, is second among that draft in win shares, only behind Karl Anthony Towns. He's actually first when you look at win shares per 48 minutes. He's also second in box plus minus, second in value over replacement player, again, only behind Karl Anthony Towns, and also second in terms of player efficiency rating. That's ahead of Devin Booker in all of these categories. Again, only behind Karl Anthony Towns. I mean, the more that I think about it, Montrezl Harrell really should even go higher in a redraft of this class. I think it's because we all have a bit of recency bias and see him now not having as much of an impact and think, why would we even have him go top 10 in a redraft? But Harrell's value is really undeniable when you stack him up with the rest of this class. Then with the number 9 pick, this is where the Charlotte Hornets took Frank Kaminsky. It's funny when you look back at just how many missed lottery picks both the Kings and the Hornets have had over the course of the last decade, but either way, they're not taking Kaminsky, although I guess he hasn't been as bad as some of these other guys drafted before him who are no longer in the league. But here the Hornets are actually going to take a player they already have on their team, and that's Kelly Oubre Jr. Kelly Oubre was another high-level recruit coming out of that class, and while Oubre struggled in his first couple of seasons in his career, he started becoming a high-level scorer, super athletic, a quick first step. He's currently putting up career highs in most statistical categories for the Hornets. The biggest knock on Oubre has really just been his inconsistent play, his poor decision-making, not a high IQ player, but the dude can get you a block if you need it and has outperformed a lot of players in this class that were selected before him. And then finally with the 10th pick, this is where the Heat selected Justice Winslow, who I remember at the time, I thought this was an incredible pickup for the Heat, getting Winslow as late as number 10. I thought Winslow was going to be a fantastic player in the NBA and end up becoming the steal of the draft. Shows how much I know. And as Winslow, well, while he's been okay, he's never really been able to amount to much in the NBA, sometimes not even able to be in his team's rotation. So at 10, instead of Winslow, the Heat are going to take Josh Richardson, who oddly enough, the Miami Heat actually took as their second round pick, 40th overall in that draft. And throughout his career, Josh Richardson has really been a solid player in the NBA, averaging a little over 12 points per game over his career on good efficiency, over 42%. He's even improved his outside shooting as well, especially last season where he shot over 44% from 3 on over 4 attempts per game. Not saying that he's this incredible player or stud in the NBA, but good enough compared to the rest of the class to be taken 10th in a redraft. Anyway, there you have it. Redrafting the 2015 class, like I said, a pretty underwhelming class when you see even in a redraft who would go top 10 in my view anyway. Let me know where you guys would have redrafted players differently in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.